Tonight's Cocktails and Politics features a special guest moderator, Professor Bryan Le Beau. Bryan holds a Ph.D. from New York University, has retired as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs from the University of St. Mary, and is currently an adjunct professor of history at the University of Missouri, Kansas City and Georgetown University. Our guest for this evening is Thomas Neale. Currently, Mr. Neale works in the legislative branch of the US government, focusing on American constitutional theory and history, American political history, US elections, with concentration on the presidency and the Electoral College, and presidential and vice presidential qualifications for office, terms, tenure, succession, and disability. He has contributed to the Library of Congress publications, such as Library of Congress Information Bulletin, Library of Congress Gazette, CRS Report, LCPA Insights, and CRS at 100, a centennial history of the Congressional Research Service. Mr. Neale has testified before committees of the House of Representatives and the Senate on various issues. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. As your roving reporter, I will be watching for any questions you may have. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you are watching via Facebook, you can also ask questions by posting them in the comment section. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator and guests for the evening, Bryan Le Beau and Thomas Neale.
Thank you, Denisha, and welcome, Tom. Thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise with us. We look forward to what you have to say. Following the lead of the APS-hosted series, Cocktails and Politics, as Denisha just explained, tonight we will host a conversation on the Electoral College, the process by which the United States has elected its president and vice president for some 230 plus years. For most of these years, while facilitating the election of 45 presidents, the Electoral College has been often the subject of intense criticism that has resulted in a few changes, but basically it has survived. And as we have one of the most contested presidential elections in history, now only a week away, with all the talk of swing states and popular and state votes, the Electoral College is once again front and center. From what I've seen, no one has written more, as Denisha just indicated, in greater detail, providing more relevant analysis, even been on C-SPAN and testified before Congress than Tom Neale. So once again, we're fortunate to have him with us tonight. To preview where we're going with this conversation so that our viewers can pace their questions accordingly, which we by all means welcome and encourage, we'll begin with a brief overview of how the Electoral College works today. We'll then look back at original intent. What did the founding fathers intend by their creation of the Electoral College? How has it fared over the years and in some cases been changed? And lastly, but perhaps most importantly for most people, recent calls for reform. Forewarning, this is a complex and detailed subject. We'll not be able to cover every nuance and eventuality in the hour we have together, but hopefully it'll provide you with some information and encourage you perhaps what your appetites to go to the APS website and look for Tom's piece on the Electoral College, how it works, which will give you much more information than we can possibly do tonight. So again, Tom, let's get started with this brief overview of how the Electoral College works today.
Thank you, Bryan, and thank you, Denisha, and for everyone else who's made it possible for me to be with you virtually this evening. The Electoral College today is it's a mystery to most of our fellow citizens, and it's certainly a mystery to people around the world. The key is that when Americans go to the polls, or when they mail in their ballots, or drop in their early voting ballots, they are actually voting for 535 presidential electors, who are the ones who do the honors, so to speak, who actually choose the president and vice president of the United States. And the way that works is that each party, major or minor, or independent candidacy that has ballot access in the various states, And it varies obviously from state to state because we are a 50-state transcontinental federal republic. Each of these organizations nominates a slate of electors is equal in number to their electoral votes as assigned under the formula in the Constitution. Now, Missouri, of course, is right in the middle, 10 electoral votes. It's right about median for the number of electoral votes. There are, however, 538, and that is equal to the total of 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. And how does each state get their electoral vote allocation? It's very simple math. It's a combination of the number of House seats they hold and the number of Senate seats they hold. So Missouri, with your 8 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and your 2 senators, you come out with 10. Now they're kind of like the giants. California is the most obviously the most populous state. They dispose of 55 electors at this point, and there are 7 states on the other end of the spectrum which only have a single member in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. So each of those states disposes of 3 electoral votes. Now that's what the Constitution tells us. The Constitution also tells us that in order to win the presidency, you must have 270 electoral votes. You must have a majority of all the electoral votes that are cast and counted in Congress. Beyond that, the means by which votes are awarded in the states is left to the states. And the states have, with 2 exceptions, I'll get to those briefly in a moment, have what we call a winner-take-all or first-past-the-post system. And that means that the candidates who win the most popular votes in any state win all of the electoral votes that that state is able to dispose of. And it's been criticized on those grounds in that it does not value the votes of the minority, and there have been many criticisms along those lines from the very beginning. But it's the way it goes at this point. The 2 exceptions, briefly, are Maine and Nebraska, and they count their popular votes 2 ways. They count them statewide, and they count them by congressional district. And the idea here is to allow the electoral vote to reflect differences in opinion in different parts of the state. So if you can imagine, the 3rd district in Nebraska, way out west, has perhaps different political leanings than Omaha. Similarly, in Maine, the 1st district, which is grabs along the coastline, may have different political leanings than the upcountry district. And so they award 1 electoral vote for each district and then 2 for the statewide winner as kind of a bonus. And that's the way it works today. Now, once these votes have been the popular vote has been cast, the states ascertain the vote and they declare the results, and the results are sent to various officials in the states, the National Archives, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the U.S. Court in the district in each state where the electors are meeting. And I assume it would be the district court in Jefferson City in Missouri, assuming you have, forgive my ignorance, assuming you have a federal court sitting in that city. Now, the electors actually do meet. They meet in their states. They do not meet in one place because the Constitutional Convention worried that if they did, that there would be political intrigue and, to use a wonderful old word, cabal, that there would be caballing. So we don't, they meet in their states. Frequently, they meet in the capital, the state capital or the state house. Some of the states make a big deal of it. Others, they just come in, they vote, and they leave. The next step then is that the certificates of the popular vote and the votes of the decision of the electors are all sealed up under great security and sent again to Washington. And the final step in this is, and by the way, the electors vote this year on December 14th. That's the second Monday after the Wednesday after the first Monday in December. The actual opening of the ballots and the counting of the votes is done in a joint session of Congress, which falls on January 6th in 2021, and that will be the 117th Congress. So it's not counted by the lame duck Congress. And at that point, the president of the Senate, who also happens to be the vice president, presides over the joint session. The votes are counted and declared, and the winners are then announced, and that is, the law says, sufficient announcement of who shall be elected president and vice president, followed 2 weeks to the day later by the inauguration of the new president, or the inauguration of a president who is continuing on to a second term. And that pretty much does it for the actual rundown on how the Electoral College works today.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tom. And it's much more complicated. Tom did a good job of summarizing it. I have a handy dandy little book here that goes into every imaginable possibility, including death and all kinds of issues that make it even more complicated, but that will certainly do for now. Now, original intent is clearly in the news again, especially with the recent nominee to the Supreme Court, now I guess the actual member of the Supreme Court, and trying to figure out what she means by original intent. But let's look at original intent in terms of the Electoral College. And Tom, perhaps you can explain to us, and as briefly as possible, what you believe was the original intent of the founding fathers who put together the Constitution and created the Electoral College.
Thank you, Brian. We have some pretty good accounts of what happened at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. Among other things, James Madison, later president, took wonderful notes that were kept a secret until after he died, and they were published after that. Some of the other delegates to the convention kept very interesting accounts of what was going on. With respect to election of the president, I think what the members of the convention, the delegates, were looking at, they were creating a new federal government of 3 branches, a strong federal government, much stronger than the government under the Articles of Confederation, which had very few powers and authorities and was constantly short of money because they didn't even have taxation power. They wanted to create the first branch, as we call it, those of us who work for Congress, the first branch, the legislative branch, to enact the laws, the second branch, the executive branch, to enforce and administer the laws, and the third branch, the judicial branch, to interpret the laws. And each of those they hoped would be a strong organization. They were very much concerned that the president be an independent authority and have a considerable discretionary powers. And they were flummoxed, I'd say is a good word, as the convention went on. And it went on from late May until mid-September of 1787. And if you've ever been in either Washington or Philadelphia, which are very similar climatically during the summer, you know that they had no air conditioning. They didn't have window screens. It was a pretty uncomfortable job. They were flummoxed at how would this president be elected? How could you preserve the independence of the chief executive from Congress, from the state legislatures? And another side question was, should it be a one term? How long should the term be? Should they be allowed to serve one term? Should there be no discussion as to how many terms they could serve? So there are a lot of questions involved in this. And I think it's also useful to remember that they had perhaps a different, first of all, they had a different sense of what democratic government was like in the 18th century. As you know, generally only white men who disposed of a certain level of income or property were allowed to vote at that time. For some reason, they forgot to mention that in the New Jersey Constitution, first New Jersey Constitution after the Revolution. So women were allowed to vote in New Jersey for almost 20 years until the legislature realized to their horror what they had done and revoked that. But that's another story for another time. And also the level of democracy in the United States in those days differed from state to state. In New England, you had the town meeting and there was a high level of participation, again, by adult males, white males, property holders mostly. And as you went further south, the influence of the planter aristocracy took hold, and you had, I'd say, a less participatory government, and the middle states were somewhere in between. So as they got down to deciding who should elect the president, a number of ideas were floated. First, that the president should be elected by Congress. Second, the president might be elected by the state legislatures. Now, both of these ran afoul of their original intent for a strong, independent president. And another proposal by James Wilson of Pennsylvania was that we should have popular election of the president. And the extraordinary point there is that only one state, Pennsylvania, was in favor of that, and all the others quickly knocked it down. So they're getting to the end of the time, and they were tired, and it was hot, and they wanted to go home, and they had a bunch of things that had to be done. So a committee on postponed matters met behind closed doors for a week, and they came forth with a kind of a hybrid plan that was a compromise, like so many compromises at the Constitutional Convention. And that called for election of the president by electors. And it left the door open to the states to decide how the electors would be chosen. It would say, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. So that meant that if a state wanted to have popular election, which some of them did from the very beginning, the electors did so. In other states, the electors were chosen by the state legislatures until quite late into the 19th century. But it was a compromise that was one of the keys to getting approval on this. Now, there's another point here that we note more recently, is that it also incorporated one of the more nefarious compromises of the Constitutional Convention, the 3/5 rule, in that it allocated presidential electors to the states according to all of their residents, not citizens, residents, and each resident who was a person held in service, as they said, in other words, people who were held in bond slavery, were counted as 3/5 of a person. And that was a part of the compromise that was had been included in the Constitution in other sections, for instance, with respect to taxation, and enumeration for the House of Representatives. So we have that early blot that was not rectified until the passage of the Civil War, ratification of the Civil War amendments. What were they thinking about with the electors? Did they think that the electors would be the agents that we see today, who are simply chosen to go in and vote what the party has decided, or what the electors who sent, the voters who sent them to Washington or to their state capitals decided? Not so. The balance of the record is that most of the convention delegates assumed that the electors would be an assembly of the most educated, best informed, and probably better off the social and economic elites, and that they would be able to make a disinterested comparison of the various worthy candidates and pick one of the best or the best. Now, what they did not reckon with, however, was that even as the convention was meeting, and even during that decade after the Revolutionary War, there's a great deal of change going on in the country, and there was a movement towards greater democratic involvement, and the strictures of the colonial period were beginning to fall away. So the one thing that they did not, with respect to the Electoral College, that they did not anticipate was this growth in democratic sentiment and also democratic voting in the states. And the second one was that they did not anticipate the birth of two political parties. The two-party system emerged almost immediately. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who later became the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans. And of course, if you're familiar with Hamilton, you know that Hamilton was the leader of the Federalist faction, later the Federalist Party, and Mr. Jefferson was the de facto head of the emerging Republican Party, which was the ancestor to today's Democratic Party. So these two developments kind of upended the rather noble concept, a flawed concept, of the founders. And as a result, we got very early into the use of the Electoral College as a device by which the political parties would nominate the candidates for elector that they could depend on, not to vote disinterestedly or independently, but to vote the way the party expected them to vote. And the other point that was adopted quite early on was what we call the winner take all, as I mentioned earlier, the general ticket system. And that was strongly adopted in most of the parties because it gave them a real advantage in rolling up the number of electoral votes, majority then as now, that were needed to win the presidency. So I have a pretty good idea of what their intention was, and it was an intention of some very intelligent and public-spirited men, but it was not in keeping in the long run with the tenor of the times and the evolution of the United States towards a much more democratic system.
I want to pursue this a little bit more, looking at some of the elections. Just a quick question, and then I understand we have some questions already from the audience. But if you could expand a bit on the electors issue and the recent court case that occurred, where some argue that the Supreme Court really went against the will of the founders in terms of locking the electors into, or allowing the states to lock in electors based on the will of the people, rather than having freedom to use their anticipated more expert or knowledge in terms of those people running for president. But could you comment on that just briefly?
Right. As early as the turn of the 19th century, in other words, as early as 1800, the electors had ceased largely to be independent actors and were expected to vote for the candidates to whom they were pledged. There have always been a few electors here, scattered handfuls from time to time, who voted against or voted for different candidates than the ones to whom they were initially pledged. We call those faithless electors. And the question of whether the original concept of the founders that the electors should be noble and disinterested public figures, or whether they should be the agents of the parties, was debated at great length. It seemed to be a largely moot constitutional issue, because there was nothing that no decisions were on this, except one minor one back in the 50s, so Bear versus Virginia, where it said the states could exact or require a pledge to vote for the popular vote winner in the state from elector candidates, but it did not provide a means of enforcement. Now, since that time, about 33 states have enacted legislation that either allows faithless electors to be stricken and replaced by alternates, or it allows civil and in some cases criminal charges to be brought against them. And this was still very much at issue after the 2016 election, the largest number of the faithless electors in modern history. And it certainly was not enough to change the election. They never have been enough to change it. But at this point, finally, there was litigation brought that found its way to the Supreme Court, and on July 6th, I believe, and much to my surprise that the court acted so quickly on it, or that they acted at all, the case of Chiafalo versus Washington. The High Court ruled that the states could, in fact, legally penalize the electors who voted against the instructions that they received in the form of the popular vote and the party to whom whose candidates to whom they are pledged. It's a big issue. It's a big sea change in the way we look at the Electoral College. And I know that I believe Washington State, the legislature acted rather quickly to make it I believe a felony offense to vote against the instructions received from the popular vote. And we'll see what else. I haven't been tracking what other states are doing, but it may mean that the era of the faithless elector, which was always a footnote to history, more or less, has come to an end.
Okay, thank you. Denisha, I understand we have a question.
Yes, we do. We have several questions from the audience. So let's start back at the founding. We did have an audience member that asked about the the 3/5 rule or the 3/5 compromise about enslaved persons. And they want to know, knowing that the Electoral College was founded and based on the 3/5 compromise, does that make the Electoral College foundationally a racist concept?
I think at the beginning, that's a pretty fair surmise. The institution of slavery was incorporated in several places in the Constitution as it was originally ratified. It's interesting that the word slavery is never mentioned, but it's usually people held in persons held in service, and everyone knew who that meant. And for instance, the slave trade was given in the original Constitution. One of the compromises was that slave trading could go on and for 20 years after the Constitution was ratified, and only then would Congress have the authority to stop it. And it did eventually in 1808, but it's a long time coming. The actual proximate 3/5 cause of with respect to the Electoral College ceased to exist when the Civil War amendments, the 13th Emancipation, the 14th full citizenship rights for formerly enslaved persons, and the 15th voting rights for formerly enslaved persons. So that ceased to be an issue at that time, but it certainly was part of the heritage, the original heritage.
I would just add a note there, takes us a little bit away from our subject, so we'll be brief. But William Lloyd Garrison, probably the leading abolitionist in the years leading up to the Civil War, when he realized that, as he put it, the Constitution recognized slavery, although it never identified it by that name. You're correct in saying that. He publicly tore up the Constitution and refused to pay attention to it. So, do you have a follow-up, Denisha, or?
Yes, we have another question. It says that when comparing the U.S. Electoral College system to other countries, what are the major advantages and disadvantages of the city we use in America? I'm sorry, of the system we use in America?
I think one of the, for better or worse, one of the most important elements of the Electoral College system is that it reflects the founders' strong belief that this was a federal republic comprised of states that even then in 1787, 1788, 1789 were different in many respects, from south to north, from low population to high population, from agricultural to trading, and so forth. And for people who support the Electoral College, this is one of the reasons they cite, is that we are not one vast mass amalgam of people. We're people in which citizens not only of the United States, but we're also citizens of our own communities as defined by the 50 states. And the 50 states, each state, I think it can't be argued against, that each state has its own political and in many cases economic and social cultures as well. So I think that could be brought up as an important point about the Electoral College. By comparison, most of the other countries that have what I would call a strong presidential system, as presidential republics, and by that I mean that the president is not only the chief of state, but also the chief executive. And that is opposed to many republics that we are familiar with, in which the president is a non-political figure who is a figurehead, essentially representing sovereignty, and the prime minister is essentially the de facto chief executive. So in our United States, the president wears both hats, and in this case, we are, as far as I know, it's unique. Let's look at for instance, France is a republic that has a strong president. It also has prime minister. But the president is I think people who know, watch President Macron realize he's a position of considerable power, executive considerable power. The president is elected by a nationwide popular poll. And they do require that the presidential candidates win either 50% on the first round or 50% on the second round. So they insist on actual majority vote. And I think you'll find that true around the world in really what are executive republics. Brazil is another one that comes to mind. That is an executive republic. Most of the South American countries follow our lead, and I believe also South Korea does. But the concept of the parliamentary form of government combined with a president or chief of state in the form of a monarch, like Queen Elizabeth, Queen of the United Kingdom, is perhaps more widely seen in the world. But again, among republics that have a strong executive, there's no such thing as an electoral college. The only other electoral colleges that I have been able to identify in the past 50 or 60 or 70 years were, for better or worse, they were in effect in countries that were at that particular moment under a military regime. Brazil had an electoral college at one point when they were governed by a military regime, and South Korea had for some years an electoral college when they too were governed by a military regime. And I don't want to draw an invidious comparison between the United States and those two countries, but it just goes to show it's a pretty unusual institution that we have.
Okay. Let me just follow up a little bit on that. One could make the case, I suppose, I'm not a defender of the Electoral College necessarily, but when you think of the number of elections that have taken place every 4 years since we began, 130 years ago or long as it's been, in most cases, the Electoral College vote tracked with the popular vote. There have only been about a half a dozen cases where that hasn't been the situation, and we may want to talk about one or two of them. But would you suggest then, or could it be argued that the Electoral College has worked pretty well?
Certainly, defenders of the Electoral College would argue that. With respect to what the critics refer to as misfires, Electoral College misfires, or wrong winner elections, there are only 4 that really come to mind as being examples of elections where it was just plain and simple that candidate A won the Electoral College but received fewer popular votes. Now, the 2 of these that have happened reasonably recently were in the year 2000, Bush v. Gore, which most of us will remember, and in the year 2016, when President Trump was elected with more electoral votes than Secretary Clinton, but fewer popular votes. Going back in time in 1888 and 1876, the same thing happened. And in one case, in 1876, it led to a really serious constitutional crisis, the results of which ultimately led to the end of Reconstruction and the gradual, or not so gradual, elimination of the rights of people of color in southern states. In 1888, by comparison, the fact that one candidate had more electoral votes and fewer popular votes, just okay. Now, it may have been due to the fact that there was the stakes weren't as high in 1888, or possibly people had just got used to it, as arguably happened in 2016. Another interesting point on that is that Karl Rove has pointed out that period in the late 19th century was a period of high levels of partisanship and also rather close division, so that the parties changed hands, control the Congress quite frequently, and the elections were highly partisan and contentious. And he argues that we're in a similar period right now. And I think there is some strong case to be made for that comparison.
Well, I would agree. And other elections that I think are interesting to look at, although we don't need to spend a lot of time on it tonight, are the 1824 and 1860 elections, where essentially the two-party system broke down. And that raised havoc with the Electoral College and how to sort it out. You had 4 candidates in each case. And how do you know, in 1860, it worked out okay for Lincoln. He got the electoral votes that he needed, but in 1824, it broke down, had to go into Congress for a solution to the problem. But unless you want to comment on that, I think Denisha has another question from the audience.
Yes, I do. I have quite a few. So let's see if we can combine a couple of these. One audience member wants to know how electoral representatives are chosen. And is there a reason we've had an increase in recent years of the number of elections where the popular vote is opposite that of the electoral vote? Could the Electoral College be just simply outdated?
Well, critics of the Electoral College would certainly say it's outdated. And their primary argument is that it does not provide, it's not in the tradition of democratic majority rule, in that because it breaks down by states, and also because it breaks down within the states by the winner-take-all system, it allows for these Electoral College misfires, in which we've had 2 in the past 20 years. I think the second part of the question, they raised the good point that Brian and I just spoke about, the fact that our period parallels the last 2 decades of the 19th century, in that the elections have been very closely fought, and not just presidency. This was true in the Congress during that period as well, and highly contentious and highly partisan. And give me the first part of the question again.
How are the electoral?
Right.
Okay.
The electors are nominated in a bewilderingly different number of methods, which reflects the fact that we are 50 states, some of which are more interesting in the way they do it than the others. I just had a call from a member of Congress in Pennsylvania today, and they said, "How are the electors in my state nominated?" And I looked at the federal law, which I knew already, that the presidential nominee chooses them. So President Trump chose all the candidates, the Republican candidates for presidential elector in Pennsylvania, and former Vice President Biden chose all the Democratic nominees for elector in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, I didn't look up Missouri before I came here, but in most states, it's done by the Central Committee of the state party. There are in some states, it's done at a state party convention. Now, Brian may be able to tell me whether either of the 2 parties in Missouri have a big convention. Nobody had a big convention this year, but I'd have to go look that up for you. But it's usually one of those 2.
Yeah, the counties, there's 3 districts in Missouri, and I'm going from memory here, and they appoint electors through sort of a convention-like system. And then there's 2 at large. So you get, two from each county or district, and then 2 at large. So, and this you raise a good point here about that I hear often when people get enmeshed in conversation about how the Electoral College functions, is eventually the light goes on and they say, why on earth did they leave so much to the states? If it's a national, federal election, why are you allowing the states, as you just indicated, it's all over the board in terms of how electors are appointed. And I suspect that goes back to our conversation of original intent, where the writers of the possible to leave things in the hands of the state rather than taking it to the federal level.
And I think that's an interesting point. Maybe they were leery of impinging too much on the power of the states, because really what you look at when you look at the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia Convention of 1787, their writ was to just prepare some amendments to the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
And they decided once they got there, without having real authorization, to throw out the Articles of Convention and start fresh, which was a very bold decision. And they kept their fingers crossed and made a lot of compromises.
I would remind those people who are talking about we ought to have a new constitutional convention to correct the Electoral College. What happened the last time we called for a constitutional convention? We ended up with a whole new constitution. Denisha, do you have another comment or question rather?
Yes, I do. So in practical terms, what obstacles are there to the national popular vote becoming strong enough to determine presidential election results, especially when the votes of low population states are at odds with the national popular vote, as occurred in 2000 and 2016?
The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is a very interesting movement. And the premise is that if enough states sign on to an interstate compact, and there are hundreds of interstate compacts in effect governing all sorts of relationships among the states, that they could do what the founders of the NPV, National Popular Vote, call an end run around the Electoral College. They could achieve direct popular election without having to amend the Constitution. And the mechanics of that are that state legislatures agree to become part of the NPV, the National Popular Vote Compact. However, the compact itself would only come into operation if and when it secures the adherence, the membership of states whose electoral vote totals are more than the 270 needed to elect. So it's interesting, an interesting point. Now, you mentioned, or your questioner mentioned, some of the small states who would obviously express maybe worries about being overwhelmed in a direct popular vote regime, or if the National Popular Vote Compact were installed. And this is a concern of less populous states, even at the Constitutional Convention, when Virginia was the great giant at that point, and places like Delaware and Rhode Island had 40 or 50,000 people. They're very small states. Some of the political scientists would tell you that they have less, smaller states, the less populous states have less advantage than they think when you're talking about the chances that they can actually swing an election. So I think that the question of the NPV and the less populous states is one that stands on tradition and on the conviction of the residents of places, states like Wyoming or the Dakotas and Montana, that they receive a certain level of extra influence under the Electoral College system, which they do arithmetically. But with respect to whether they actually get to influence the results of the election, it's not so sure. There are other schools of thought.
But yeah, we are looking at some states being very important. We call them swing states. That's no news to anyone. I was looking at the Washington Post online today, and one of the headlines was about who was leading in the presidential count or polling, but then it quickly added, but this isn't a national election. Then they went on to talk about the 6 or 7 states that they're monitoring very closely. So to a lot of people, I think they throw up their hands like in Missouri or Kansas thinking, well, we just don't matter. No one more, fly over country in terms of the presidential election. But, that's, one, I think, common criticism of the Electoral College.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But on the other hand, similarly, one of the big electoral giant, for instance, California, receives almost no visits by presidential or vice presidential candidates, even though they control 55 electoral votes.
Right.
And the reason for that is that they are a reliably Democratic voting state. So they're not a battleground state. And there is except under very rare circumstances, national campaigns of the two parties think, why should we spend resources, if they're the Democrats trying to encourage voting in a state we know we will win, and the Republicans on the other side of that same coin would say, why should we throw money away sending our candidates and surrogates and spending money on paid advertising in California because we know we're not going to get it. So the battleground state has to be a battleground state. There has to be a chance that either party could win under the right circumstances. And I think it also helps to have a tidy packet of electoral votes, such as Ohio or Pennsylvania. And now apparently Florida has come into play with 29 electoral votes, which is a big group.
Right.
Texas is still reliably a Republican state. Some people suggested that they may come into play as a battleground state within the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you talked about that is very often voiced, and then we'll go back to the audience questions, is the idea of winner take all versus proportionally vote. And you mentioned Nebraska. We lived in Nebraska for a while, and it was very interesting to see the vote, the awarding of electoral votes, and you got three such very different districts. But proportional vote versus winner take all, you can have someone come very close in a number of major states. And still, win in the popular vote and lose in the electoral vote. But that's, I think, one of the considerations to be sure.
Well, I think that's a very good point. And I think this illustrates the fact that the broad leeway that the Constitution provides the states with respect to how they award their electoral votes is not a bad thing entirely. Now, maybe the winner-take-all general ticket system is a bad thing. Some people think so. Other people love the winner-take-all system. But there are other options. As Brian just mentioned, the district system, which in a state like Missouri, you have several distinct areas in the state
Right.
that where the congressional districts might vote a different way. And you could very easily, I could see in Missouri having a breakdown of, say, for instance, 3 districts for one party and 5 for the other, or 4 and 4, whatever. So there would be an allocation of electors that reflected the breakdown of the congressional districts. Now, there's another proposal that has never been incorporated in the states that would require the electoral votes to be awarded proportionally, down to the largest integer, to whole numbers. For instance, let's say I always used to use Missouri as my example because it has 10 electoral votes and it's right in the median, and also 10 is easy to divide. So let's say the candidate A has 60% of the votes in Missouri and candidate B has 40% of the votes, discounting obviously minor parties for the purpose of this argument. Under a proportional system, candidate A would win 6 electors and electoral votes. Candidate B would win 4. And people point out that that would be a fairer award of electoral votes because the people who are in the minority, the 40% under the winner-take-all system, it's close but no cigar, as they say. So these are some interesting proposals that have been floated over the years.
Denisha, we have about 5 minutes left for any questions you want to pose at this point.
Sure. Let me combine another one of these questions, or another couple of these questions. So, if upcoming elections ends with the result of an electoral college win for one candidate versus a popular vote for another candidate, does this question the legitimacy of the elected president? And if they're not tallied, the electoral college votes are not tallied until December, what's happening on election night?
Well, I think we've had a lot of discussion about what's going to happen between election night and December 14th. And I think there will be probably some pretty hot maneuvering going on in the states. The states have their own procedures for determining contested elections within the states. It's not a federal responsibility. Now, to some extent, the federal law is, and it's a very arcane law from 1887, the Electoral Count Act. If the states do have on election night procedures in place to deal with disputed elections, and if they use those, then the results, if they arrive at a result by December 6th, 8 days before the election, which we call the safe harbor date, then the state results are not open to challenge. The question is, how many states have that kind of safe harbor legislation? We had I had today, I was on the phone with a staff member from another state I won't mention, where they were worried that there might be a disputed election, and could the state legislature come into session and award the electoral votes, or could the governor, because in their state both were possibilities. So there's a lot of wiggle room there, and there has been, in fact, there have been a couple of bills introduced in the House and the Senate that would extend that window, and by pushing back the vote of the electors from December 14th to sometime closer to the count of the electoral votes, January 6th. So that would give the states more time if the election contests were particularly difficult to solve.
You know, you point to one thing here that always comes up when we talk about reform. One of the really complicated matters, I'm sure you could go into more detail than I, but the idea, what can you change by statute, by Congress, and what will require a constitutional amendment? And when you get down to that, people really begin to get panicky, like, oh my God, it would take forever to get a constitutional amendment through. So let's go for, you know, a statute from Congress. So that's certainly one of the themes you get very often when you talk about reform. So.
Well, that's an interesting point. And actually, the Constitution does provide a fairly liberal grant of authority to the Congress, because the times, places, and manner of the date on which the electors are chosen is the same throughout the country. And the United States, the federal government, through law, by law, has to be in statute law, controls the times, manner, and places of election of senators and representatives. So they are not without authority. A constitutional amendment is so difficult and so time-consuming to propose in Congress, and then propose to the states, and then have the necessary 3/4, that's 38 states, ratify it generally within 7 years, that it's very difficult to conceive of a constitutional amendment concerning the Electoral College, barring a really serious misfire followed by a serious contentious aftermath.
Denisha, we have maybe 2 minutes left. Do you want to throw in another question or two?
Well, I think a lot of them have been answered.
Okay.
Let's see. Again, we have folks that are really interested in the pros and cons of a proportional system where elections are selected based on the popular vote in each state, and the difference between this and simply electing a president by popular vote.
Well, I mean, there's a famous quote that's attributed to Sir Isaiah Berlin, a great British philosopher, and he said he was quoting a Greek author. He said, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And I've always said that if you want to use that simile or analogy, direct popular election is one big thing. Person who wins the most popular votes, either a plurality or majority, wins. It's very simple, and it's been adopted in most of the countries in the world. The Electoral College is the fox. It has the states. It has the winner take all. It has the contingent election, which we didn't get into tonight, and a good thing, because it would have gobbled up all of our time. So it's a question of a nuanced system that is part constitutional, part state authority, part political parties. It's really kind of an extraordinary mosaic of different elements. With respect to proportional, if there's plenty of information out there on the web, and good information, not all junk, and if people who've been with us tonight and participated with questions are interested in proportional representation, I discuss it in my reports. All CRS reports are now public domain and are available from congress.gov/CRS reports. Or you can just go online and Google proportional representation or proportional award of electoral votes. A proportional representation is, for instance, in legislative bodies, is a different and perhaps more involved question, which we won't get into this evening.
Do you anticipate, I guess it depends on how this election turns out, but do you anticipate another groundswell for reform? Or do you think, as has happened in most cases in the past, once the election's over, everyone just moves on to something else in their life?
You know, I've been tracking this issue since I was a young man, and I'm obviously not a young man now. I always used to say to my audiences prior to the year 2000, they would ask that question, what are the prospects for reform? And I always said that, well, if we ever have another misfire, I think there would be a very strong case for reform, and we might even see an amendment proposed. That has not happened. Didn't happen in 2000, and it didn't happen in, pardon me, I just lost my video, and there I'm back. That's one of the little problems with our system here. It didn't happen in 2000. It didn't happen in 2016. That's not to say proposed amendments were not introduced in Congress, but there's been no action on them basically since the 60s and 70s.
You know, you mentioned it, and it's interesting to look back at some of the contested elections in the past, and it's amazing, at least interesting, I guess, on my part, is how they're settled in different manners. You know, sometimes it goes into the Congress, sometimes, you know, by vote of Congress, sometimes they get together and reach a compromise and then bring it back to Congress. Other times it goes into the courts, as it did in Florida, for example. So there's when people ask sometimes, well, what happens if, assuming that there's going to be some contest as a result of the election, who knows who's going to make the final decision on that? So, unless you want to look into your crystal ball, Tom, and predict on something like that, we can let it go. So
I would hope the example of the election of 1876 and the Electoral Commission of 1877, which had such disastrous results for civil rights and voting rights in this country, if that's an example of what we might expect from a highly contested election, I think we should do whatever is possible to avoid that and to make the existing provisions work. We do have the Electoral Count Act. We do have contingent election. We do have the ability in Congress, when the electoral votes are counted, for members of Congress to protest, to file objections to these votes, and then Congress decides whether a particular state the votes have been improperly given, and they can be stricken. So there are actually checks and balances within this system, but I think my own personal opinion is that we need to make what we have in place work, and it can be done. It's not always easy, but better than going out on a limb and trying something like Congress did in 1876, 1877.
Right, very good. And I just add to that, hopefully with a 230-year tradition of transition of power or authority in a peaceful manner. But let's end it there, Tom. And I want to thank you very much. Your comments were very, very helpful. I want to direct people once again whose appetites we may have whetted by our conversation today to go to the APS website and look for your Electoral College, how it works. It's a great document that I think will answer a lot of their questions. But for now, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Right, and back to Denisha and Claire.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Thomas Neale, for joining us this evening. I would also like to thank all of you who tuned in for tonight's program, and thank you very much for your questions. We really appreciate that. At the conclusion of this event, you'll be directed to a short post-event survey. Please take a few moments to complete. This information helps us as we continue to plan our events and help us improve, and lets us know what kind of programs our supporters want to see. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe conversations like this are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. Our members help support our programs and allow us to continue providing a space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits on our website. Once again, we at American Public Square at Jewel, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening. Cheers.